Okay, so I'm sorry about that for wasting those 10 minutes of your time. Let's get into chapter 3. Chapter 3 talks about the tissues of the body. Tissues means a collection of two or more of the same kind of cell. And there are a bunch of different types of cells in the body, and they fall into one of these three main four umbrellas. The first, she told us, is epithelial tissue. They're linings. They cover surfaces and line internal cavities and chambers and passageways. The second type is connective tissue. Connective tissue as a category and as a whole is this very broad family of cell types that are everything from fat cells to our blood, to our bones, and the ligaments and tendons that connect bones to one another and the muscles to bones. It's a really diverse family of tissues. It's the group on here that's the most diverse and different. The third one is muscle tissue. There are three kinds of muscle in our bodies. The most common one that most people have heard of is called skeletal muscle, because those are muscle cells that are attached to our bones, and when they contract, they allow us to move our bones. We do that voluntarily. We tell skeletal muscles to contract, and they contract. It's an awake, conscious process. But there's two other kinds of muscles that we're not in voluntary control over. These are involuntary muscle. One example is cardiac muscle. Our hearts beat 70 or 80 or 90 times a minute, an hour, and day in and day out, and week in, week out for 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 years without stopping. And they do it without us ever flexing that muscle ourselves or contracting it ourselves. Cardiac muscle cells are found only in the wall of the heart, and when they contract, they squeeze on the chambers of the heart and they pump blood through the heart. The last kind of muscle tissue is also involuntary. It's called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is found all over the place in our body, and they're muscle cells that contract and shorten just like any other muscles, but they're involuntary, and they have the purpose of changing the diameter of blood vessels, making them larger or smaller, pushing through food through the intestine, changing the diameter of our pupils. It's all over the place in the body, and we'll talk about examples of those as we go. But smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are definitely not voluntary, and skeletal muscle is the type of muscle that we can control and move. Finally is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is all the cells of the nervous system. It's the famous neurons that send and receive messages, but it's also all of the supporting cells that allow neurons to do their job by nourishing them and supporting them and protecting them. Those are called neuroglial cells. And you have neurons and you have neuroglial cells in the nervous system, and together they make up this family of nervous tissue. So here are the four types. Every tissue in the body, no matter what it is, no matter which of the four umbrellas and which specific example, all tissues are made of a couple parts. We have cells, and we have extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix means anything that surrounds those cells. Typically material that those cells themselves have made and secreted and surrounded themselves in. But all tissues have these two parts in different ratios. Epithelial cells, the first type of tissue to really talk in detail about, has lots and lots and lots of cells, very little space between, very little extracellular matrix. Epithelial has lots of cells and very little extracellular matrix. It's the opposite of connective tissue, which has really very few cells, a ton of extracellular matrix, very few, small handful of cells sprinkled, surrounded in an ocean of extracellular matrix. Okay? And the other two being kind of somewhere in between. So when it comes to this first umbrella of epithelial tissue, these are the features of this kind of tissue. First feature is cellularity. It means it has lots of cells. They're close together. They're standing shoulder to shoulder like soldiers typically, and very little or no intracellular space. Remember that There's no absolutes really in the body, but I would say almost none or extremely little. As well, these cells, because they're lining a surface, there's a side of them that's exposed, and there's the other side which is secured to the surface of this lining. Imagine a wallpaper that has a design on one side, and on the other side it has a glue that's attaching it to whatever wall it's on. Okay? This is what a couple of epithelial cells might look like. These are very close to one another with almost no space in between. They're securely attached to one another by these structures known as desmosomes. Desmosomes are like pieces of complicated, complex sticky tack that stick two cells together. They're also attached to the floor. They're attached to whatever surface they're lining. Hemidesmosomes are structures that have that function. Hemidesmosomes attach epithelial cells to the floor underneath. The floor we call the basement membrane. The basement membrane is like the boundary between an epithelial lining and whatever's deep to it. Also, there are hollow tunnels between some cells that allow things to freely pass back and forth. These are called gap junctions. These are 1, 2, 3 types of intracellular connections that are important to learn. Okay. Another feature of epithelial tissue is called attachment. What it means is they're aligning, but they're not floating out in space. A lining is attached to something else, something deep to it. And you could say that an epithelial lining is the outermost layer of something, and it's secured really quite tightly to whatever's beneath it. What's beneath it is called the basement membrane, and when I say neighbor's fence, what I mean is we have a layer of cells that are lining whatever surface. That's the epithelial tissue. And deep to epithelial tissue is always connective tissue, always. It's always some kind of connective tissue. And those two tissue types are connected by a basement membrane, a BM basement membrane. Both of those tissues contribute to it. Epithelial tissue helps build the basement membrane, and so does connective tissue, and what you end up with is this fence between those two tissue types. It's called the basement membrane. It's important because if this cell develops a cancer and starts to grow and multiply, it could grow outward towards the exposed surface. It could also invade deep. And if it crosses the basement membrane, that really changes the situation for that patient, because the cancer then has access to blood vessels and lymphatic vessels that are not present in epithelium. Avascularity means no blood vessels. Epithelial tissue does not have a direct blood supply. The blood supply in the body is in the connective tissue, deep to the basement membrane. So all the good things and nutrients within this blood vessel have to float across the basement membrane. It's called diffusion. It has to diffuse across the basement membrane to reach the epithelial cell. Epithelial cells rely on the fact that materials can float out of blood vessels across the basement membrane and into their cells. They rely on that. They're dependent on it because there are no blood vessels superficial to the basement membrane. Okay? Here's a picture of these. This is two epithelial cells, very little space in between. In teal, we have this basement membrane, and deep to the basement membrane is going to be some kind of connective tissue. They're attached to one another via desmosomes. They're attached to the basement membrane via hemidesmosomes. And because these are linings, I know it's only two cells, but imagine a big sheet of these cells. We've got, an exposed surface, and then we've got the basement type surface. Okay. Down here we've got the basement membrane and the connective tissue beneath it. These are epithelial cells. And out here is the outside world, or whatever it is they're like. Suppose these cells were our skin. Our skin is attached, really securely attached to connective tissue beneath. And then out here we've got the world. If we were in a rainstorm, the rain would come down and hit our skin. This is the outermost, most superficial part of the body, would be this apical surface of skin cells. In general, epithelial cells function to protect and form barriers. They're especially effective at this if there's more than one layer of epithelial cells. Any areas where there's abrasion or chances of drying out or chemical exposure or exposure to extremes in temperature, we find many layers of epithelial cells in order to protect the body against those. An example would be the skin. The skin has many layers of epithelial cells, not one layer of cell. And so the fact that there's all those layers make it really good at protecting. The back of our throats and inside our mouths, many layers of epithelial cells, because we're drinking hot liquids and alcohol, and breathing in smoke and pollution, and swallowing things without chewing them well, and all of those cells are really getting rubbed and scraped and beaten and battered, and so there's many layers of those, and they protect. In other areas of the body, they're responsible for this word called permeability. Permeability means the ability for something to pass through. So a coffee filter is permeable. Liquid can pass through. A piece of saran wrap, not permeable. Cheesecloth, permeable. Your t-shirt, permeable. On a window, glass is permeable to light, but a big thick piece of black curtain, not permeable to light. In areas of the body where things have to pass through, maybe it's dissolved gases or maybe it's water, we typically have one layer of epithelial cells so that those materials can easily pass through. Having many layers of cells there would be really harmful. It would not be helpful, it probably would be harmful. Same thing in reverse. If you had one single teensy epithelial cell as a part of your skin, you could scrape your whole skin off very easily. It would be a horrible protective layer. Okay. So the structure of these tissues determines or contributes to their function. Some of these epithelial cells in really special areas work together with the nervous system in our special senses like taste and smell and sight. And then some of these epithelial cells actually produce juicy secretions like hormones that get secreted into the bloodstream, or mucus that gets secreted into our airways or our intestinal tract or our throat. Any epithelial cells that make things and secrete them we call glands. We'll talk a lot more about glands later, sometime later. Some epithelial cells have these extensions of their cell membrane that make more surface area, such as in the intestine. Throwing up these fingers of cell membrane give more surface area to absorb nutrients. Some of these epithelial cells have long hairs kind of growing out the top of them that can actually move. The cell can use them to sweep bacteria or dust up and out of the lungs and that type of thing. Those are called cilia. In the lungs, a big sheet of these cells that are covered in cilia can kind of do like a crowd surfing kind of thing and take a piece of bacteria and beat it up and away from the deep parts of the lungs up and into the trachea where it can be coughed up and get removed. Whatever type or area you're talking about, if it's going to do those jobs, all those cells have to be secured to one another pretty tightly. Probably pretty water and airtight for our intents and purposes, and that's what some of these desmosomes and hemidesmosomes are for. As well, it's helpful that these cells can communicate with one another. And that's the idea of these gap junctions. Gap junctions allow communication molecules, calcium or sodium or potassium or whatever the case may be, to float back and forth between the cells, and it really helps a tissue to send a message to all the cells in the tissue really rapidly. It says they're usually packed together, connected to one another. These are the kind of words I think of when I think of epithelial tissue. Okay? And this shows you the bottom corner of a couple of these cells, very tightly connected to each other, also secured to a teal basement membrane that in turn connects the epithelium to this connective tissue that's deep to it. When I think of epithelium, there's a lot of different types of it, and the way we classify it is by first its shape. There are 3 shapes for epithelial cells. Also, we can categorize them by number of layers. An epithelial tissue can have 1 layer or more than 1 layer. There's 1 layer of epithelial cells, we call it simple. Simple means 1 layer of cells. 1 single, teensy, thin cell thick. If there's more than 1 layer, anyone know what that's called? Called stratified. Stratified means more than 1 layer. It could be 2, it's usually a lot more than 2. It's usually 30, 40, 50, a lot, many layers. Okay? So every epithelial tissue, we have to say is it simple or stratified, and then we can talk about the shapes of the cells. What are the shapes?
Cuboidal.
There's a cuboidal cell. Cuboidal means cube-shaped, like a dice or a Rubik's Cube. And there's a nucleus. There's a cell membrane, where the cell is just about as wide as it's tall. It has a cell membrane, just like every cell. It has a nucleus and mitochondria and ribosomes and whatever, just like every cell. But it's shaped like a cube. The next type, say there's one that's very flat and thin, like a frisbee or a pancake or a fried egg. We call it, it's a squashed cell. It's called squamous. Squamous or squashed means like a scale, like a fish scale. So some of these cells are flat. If you look at it from the side, it looks like that. If you look at it from the top, it looks like that. They're flat like a frisbee or a pancake or a fried egg. These look really pretty much exactly like fried egg. Last shape is taller than it is wide. What is it called? It's called columnar. It's shaped like a column. So here we can now build 6 types of epithelial tissue. We could have a simple squamous epithelium that has 1 layer of flat cells. We could have stratified squamous epithelium where there's many layers of flat cells. We could have simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified columnar. Okay? So when I'm asking you and teaching you and testing you about all these things for epithelial tissue, you can never just say it's simple. It's never just merely simple. It's simple and the shape. You can't just name a tissue as cuboidal. It might be, but you have to also note if there's 1 layer of cuboidal cells or many. So always use these 2 together. Okay? So let's start to look through some of these specific examples. So this just says what I just said. Simple epithelium is a single layer. And an example of a simple squamous epithelium is the parietal pleura, the visceral pleura, pericardium, the peritoneum. Those are all layers, 1 simple squamous cell thick. Stratified epithelium, 2 layers or more, usually quite a few more. An example of that would be the skin, or the lining of the oral cavity, or the lining of the rectum, the vagina, areas that are subject to mechanical or chemical stress. This is what simple squamous epithelium looks like under the microscope, and this is a cartoon of it. I'm going to show you guys how to replicate these images under the microscope, because I'm going to be testing you on them. And on the exam, I'm going to do my best to perfectly duplicate the picture that's in the book. It's definitely possible. What we're looking at here is one layer of these squamous fried egg-shaped cells. And if you look at it head on, you can't tell if it's one layer or not, because you're looking at it straight on. So if I ever show you this, I'll show you head-on view, and I'll tell you this is an aerial view. And I'll show you also a side view. This is what a side view would look like. You know, if I'm showing you something for this tissue type, I'll make sure you know, because otherwise this could also be stratified squamous. But that's what they look like from head on. Look down here. This is stratified squamous. This is many layers of flat cells. But what about these? Don't you think these are cube-shaped? So a stratified tissue is always named for its most superficial cells. These cells change shapes as you go from deep up to superficial. And they start out juicy and plump, and they become flat and squamous. So we call it stratified squamous because we named them according to the most superficial layer of cells. This is what the inside of the oral cavity looks like. Below this red line here is some connective tissue, and above it is epithelial tissue known as stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, here's another look at it. Here's some common locations, and here's its functions. This is what it looks like in a cartoon, and this is what it looks like in the microscope. Those are the things to learn for the test. Areas that they're found, the general functions they perform, and what they look like. Another combination of these, you could build a simple cuboidal epithelium, a single layer of cube-shaped cells. These are really great for kidney tubes and some endocrine glands that have to make products. They really look just like this, if it's a good slide. They look just like these little boxes. And you see a cuboidal shaped cell here, I boxed in red. Just deep to it is other stuff. And what other stuff, we're not worried about right now, but there's something, but what it's definitely not is another row of cube-shaped cells. Does that make sense? Okay. Compare it to down here. Here we have the most superficial layer lining this empty tube. Look right deep to it is another one just like it. This is a stratified cuboidal epithelium. It's rare, but it exists. Simple columnar, single layer of column-shaped cells. Great example is inside the gut, lining the intestine. These column-shaped, taller than they are wide. Their nuclei are all in a row, more or less at the same level, and they all look like columns. Okay. Sorry, there's some repetition in these slides. Here's a stratified columnar tissue. It's rare. It's quite rare, and it's not easy to distinguish from a couple other things, so I don't typically put it on the lab exam. But I do want you to know, like, what does that mean? It means multiple layers of column-shaped cells. Where is it typically found? The throat. These are the cells that make breast milk. These are the cells that make saliva. Okay. And typically these are protective cells, or they make products. Okay. Outside of those 6, there are a couple of weird ones. The first weird one is called pseudostratified columnar, pseudostratified ciliated columnar. What it means is, who knows what pseudo means? It means fake or false. It means it looks like it's stratified, but it's not. It looks like it's more than one layer, but it's actually one layer of columnar-shaped cells. And it looks like that because of how the cells are shaped. This cell right here actually has a bit of its cell membrane that comes down and attaches to the basement membrane. So does this one. This one looks like it stops here, but in reality, it comes all the way down and attaches. All of these do. Their nuclei are at many levels. They look stacked on top of each other. They have a pink mohawk of cilia on top. And the other thing about these cells that is the dead giveaway that I'm going to show you in lab under the microscope is they have bright blue circles in them, here and there. They are bright blue, you can't miss them. It's the only cell type that has these. They're full of mucus. These cells can secrete mucus to help lubricate the airways and stuff. And these cells, putting all that stuff together, nothing else looks like pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And I'll point that out again in lab. But those blue cells, blue mucus globs, and the pink mohawk, and the nuclei in many different levels, this is the only thing that can look like that. This is definitely not going to be on the lab exam because transitional epithelium lines the bladder. When the bladder is relaxed, the cells look quite plump. When the bladder is full and stretched out, the cells get stretched out. So these cells can transition between different shapes. So it's called transitional epithelium. And it's kind of crappy to test you on it because you don't know if it's a full or empty bladder, so I don't put it on the lab exam. We'll talk more about it at the very end of the urinary system, if we want, or not. Some epithelial tissue produce these products. They produce these secretions called, well, there's all sorts of things they could produce. And they're sort of a specialized version of epithelia that makes something, and they secrete it out. They might secrete it out into the outside world, where their secretions and products exit the body. These are called exocrine glands. Sweat glands are an example. Sweat glands make sweat and squirt it out onto the surface of the skin into the outside world. Endocrine glands, endo means inside, endocrine glands make products called hormones, and they secrete them into the bloodstream, never to the outside world. So that's endo, inside the body. Exo is exits the body, or external to the body. Okay. So that's epithelial tissue. Questions about epithelial tissue? Yes?
So what do those glands look like for somebody with like anhidrosis or something, where they can't sweat?
It's a great question. Do they appear different in anhidrosis? So I don't know. They might look atrophied or shriveled down a bit. But when someone asks me a question like that, I don't know. I have a black notebook that I write it, and I will look it up and tell you next time. But I don't know. But I will find out. That's a good question. All right. So the next umbrella. So the question is basically, how do sweat glands appear in the condition known as anhidrosis, people who are capable of sweating or who don't sweat normally? So I'll figure that out. The next umbrella is going to be connective tissue. Connective tissue is complicated because even though epithelial tissue has a bunch of different functions, but it's even more different than that. It's even more diverse than that. And so under connective tissue, we've got three main categories. The first one we call connective tissue proper. And the second one, what's the second one called? Fluid is one. Fluid connective tissue. And the third one is supporting connective tissue. And now even just by these names, you can tell how different they all are. Connective tissue, though, no matter what it is characterized by or known or recognized by having really relatively few cells and really swimming in an ocean of what we call extracellular matrix, which is all of the stuff that those cells make and surround themselves in. It's almost like if I was knitting, actually I feel like this is like in a cartoon or something, but if you knit and knit and knit and knit and fill a room with a giant scarf, you're surrounding yourself, that's kind of what it's like. Cells make these protein fibers and they make this fluid and they surround themselves in it. So the extracellular matrix is now outside of the cell, extra, but it was made by those cells. They produced it. An example of this is cartilage cells. They make this firm but jelly type of substance called cartilage, but there's cells who are responsible for making it, but they squirt it outside themselves and surround themselves in it. And it's really only a few small handful of cells, but a piece of cartilage is mostly the jelly stuff that they've made. If you look at this list, and you can just read it, but you see the functions here are really, really wide, diverse functions. And these are the three types. In connective tissue proper, cells make fibers out of protein. You know, fibers being like string-shaped material. Some of the strings are very fine and delicate. Some of them are elastic. Some of the fibers are thick, like big ropes that are strong and can't be pulled apart, like collagen. And then there are some that are in between, like reticular fibers. Sometimes those fibers are packed in tight like sardines into that tissue, and sometimes it's loose like a junk drawer with lots of empty space. Okay, that's connective tissue proper. In fluid connective tissue, there are cells, of course, but the extracellular matrix of fluid connective tissue is a liquid. Example, blood with red and white blood cells, and then the liquid they're floating in, which we call plasma. Red blood cells float down a river inside our blood vessels, and the river water is this stuff called plasma, it's the liquid, but it's a connective tissue. Supporting connective tissue, this is an interesting category, and we'll talk more about it when we get to it, especially bone. Bone's extracellular matrix hardens. The bone cells make this mineral extracellular matrix that becomes very hard. And so all of these are really different, but they have those few things in common. Here's what it looks like. So category 1, connective tissue proper. These are all the kinds of cells that you might find in connective tissue proper, some combination of these. And there are some stem cells called mesenchymal cells. There are some cells that make collagen and cells that will become, like those baby versions of the cells that will mature into the cells we make. There are cells called macrophages which come through and eat up and sweep up debris like street sweepers. There are often fat cells, and then in some places there are cells that give color or pigment to the tissue, like the melanocytes in skin producing melanin, which gives skin the pigment. All right, I'm not going to ask you this on a test. What is the function of fibroblasts? But I'm just putting it in there so you can see the diversity of cells found in connective tissue proper.
Will you expect us to be able to list out the cells?
No. Well, as we go through specific tissues and body systems, I'll point out the important cells. Like when we talk about skin, I'll talk to you more about melanocytes. But no, you don't have to memorize that table right now. Those tables. I told you that part of the extracellular matrix of connective tissue are these fibers, which are string-shaped or rope-shaped. There are really three big types, and these are important. There's collagen, which is like a big rope. It has tensile strength, which means it resists breaking when you pull it in a direction. Something like you know, like those yellow nylon ropes that you take camping or that you see sometimes, those things have a lot of tensile strength. A rope, you can't snap it and break it. You also can't stretch it at all. Compare it to elastic fibers. Elastic fibers you can definitely stretch. And even, most of the time they can return to their original shape. But you could also snap a rubber band for sure. Rubber bands have very little tensile strength. So those two fibers have different purposes. They have their ups and downs. Collagen fibers tend to be really thick, juicy, pink, like this and like this. Elastic fibers are thin, dark purple. Okay. And then these dark purple circles are cells. These are cells, and you can see there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so on this whole slide. There's lots of other stuff. Okay. So these are the cells kind of circling in blue, and they've surrounded themselves in this matrix of stuff. Over here, some cells, some cells, some cells. In this tissue, they've made this dark branching fiber called reticular fiber. Right? So now let's talk about these specifics. This is our number one, connective tissue proper. And we can break this into two major categories. The first is loose, and the second is dense. And loose and dense simply mean how tight is the stuff packed in. How much light is shining through on the microscope? How much empty space is there? In this areolar tissue and reticular tissue, there's a lot of white. There's a lot of empty space. Do you kind of see that? Compare it to this one. Compare it to this one. These collagen fibers, these thick, red, wavy fibers are packed tightly together, almost no empty space. So loose means there's a lot of empty space there. It's like a junk drawer. Dense means everything's packed really tightly together. It's more like if you had a drawer and you put in Kleenex boxes and you packed it all perfectly in and you filled up all the space. That's more like dense. The first type of connective tissue proper that's loose is called areolar. It's really the most abundant and common type. And I think of it as packing peanuts. If there's empty space in the body, more than likely it's filled in with some loose areolar connective tissue. There's lots of different types of cells in this tissue type, and there's multiple types of fibers. There's some elastic fibers thrown in, there's some thick collagen fibers thrown in. This slide looks like this. It looks loose and open, with lots of space. It's got lots of different types of fibers and cells. It looks like the junk drawer in the kitchen. The next type is adipose tissue. Does anyone know what it is? It's fat. These are fat cells. These are cells that within their cell membrane, they make a lot of lipid, which looks clear or transparent on the slide. It's like filling a cell up with butter or coconut oil or bacon grease. And the cells make so much of that fat, it pushes the nucleus off to one side. It fills up the whole cell and it pushes the nucleus off to the side, or the nucleus is up on the side of the cell membrane, and the rest of the cell is filled up, and it looks like this honeycomb thing. Okay, so those circles are the fat cells that are full of fat. These actually rest pretty close to one another in this slide, but it is still a loose connective tissue. In many areas, there's more space in between these cells. They're not like tightly packed together all over the place. So you see how different these two slides look. Marshmallows, wide open spaces, honeycomb, wasp nest. Third type is called reticular. Reticular reminds me of the cherry blossom tree. Do you guys know the trees I'm talking about? That's what it reminds me of, and the dark black branching lines are the reticular fibers. And then the smaller, darker circles are the cells. See? See? Told you. There's lots of reticular tissue in the liver, kind of surrounding the liver cells and providing kind of some structure and stability and stuff. The liver and the spleen, inside the lymph nodes. These are like building materials. This is like construction materials, connective tissue. After loose, we have dense, 3 types as well. We have dense regular, we have dense irregular. And the difference in these is that in dense connective tissue, the cells, which are little purple dots on here, surround themselves in these long ropes of collagen, but they lay them all right next to each other, parallel. These are parallel rows of thick collagen ropes. They're all lined up. In elastic tissue, same thing. Elastic fibers all lined up. I'm not going to ask you to recognize elastic tissue on the lab exam. It looks too much like other stuff. I'll say that again and stuff, but just remember. But this dense regular connective tissue looks like Ariel's wig. Red, wavy. It's wavy. This is the only tissue that's wavy like that. It looks a little bit like smooth muscle, but smooth muscle isn't wavy like I dipped my fingers in finger paint and went like that. So next to this one, wavy is the trick to recognize this one on the exam. Dead giveaway. Do you see the waviness I'm talking about? When I'm crazy and making it up? Compare dense regular to dense irregular. Dense irregular means they are not parallel. Those ropes are laid out in every which way in many different directions. A lot of ropes going in the same direction are very strong if you pull on the ropes. But if you pull on that big bundle of ropes this way, not strong anymore. So dense irregular connective tissue is great when the stress is in one direction, like the tendons that hold our muscles to our bones. They're pulled in one direction, very strong. Dense irregular connective tissue is great for areas where they'll get pulled from many directions, like the connective tissue that secures our superficial layer of skin to the fat underneath, the dermis. The dermis is dense irregular connective tissue, or part of the dermis, most of the dermis. And because our skin gets pulled in many directions. So this tissue is strong, being pulled in many different directions, and the fibers are definitely not in a line. They're definitely going every which way. Elastic is the last kind of dense. I am not going to make you recognize that on a slide because it looks a lot like other stuff. The point here is that these cells make elastic fibers which can stretch and return to their original size, just like elastic in a waistband that you know about. And it's found in the walls of big blood vessels. The big blood vessels right next to the heart are pounded by the high pressures of the pumping heart, and as that big wave of blood is pushed through them, kind of stretches them out a little bit. And the elastic layer in that wall allows them to return to their original size and shape. So it's handy. So it's connective tissue, it's connective tissue proper, it's loose or dense. It's loose areolar, adipose or reticular. It's dense, regular, irregular, or elastic. So being able to write out this sort of family tree or this kind of diagram is important to keep everything straight. Okay. Next type will be fluid. We are not going to talk about fluid connective tissue much at all right now. But the two major types are blood and lymph. We'll talk about those in the cardiovascular unit. But just like every other connective tissue, there's cells and there's matrix. Their cells are like the red and white blood cells, and their matrix is like the liquid plasma of the blood. Leave everything else alone for now. Last type is called supporting connective tissue. Where's that? There's a really good summary slide of that earlier. But supporting connective tissue is cartilage and bone. Cartilage and bone. 3 types of cartilage, 2 types of bone. Cartilage, we've got elastic cartilage. Where is there elastic cartilage found in your body? A type of cartilage will spring back to its original shape if you move it. So the ear, for instance, the external ear springs back into its original shape if you move it. The cartilage in the nose is a different type of cartilage. It's the most common type of cartilage in the body. It's called hyaline cartilage. It means glass. Actually, let me just show you before I get too far ahead of myself. This is what elastic cartilage looks like. It looks really similar to other stuff. I don't put elastic cartilage on the lab exam. I also don't put fibrocartilage on the lab exam. It looks way too much like other stuff. But the type of cartilage that will be on the exam is the most common type. And it's beautiful when you recognize it and see it for what it is. There's nothing else that looks like it because the cells look like eyeballs. A lot of cells do, but they're in this ocean of this sort of not totally see-through pink or purple stained glass. Really kind of few cells, a lot of this kind of, they call it ground glass or stained glass. There's not a lot of empty space on this slide at all, but there is some stuff that's more see-through, and that's the cartilage matrix that these chondrocytes make. Chondrocytes are cells that make cartilage. And the cartilage itself is the kind of sort of opaque, pretty material in between. Okay, that's hyaline cartilage. It's found in part of the nasal septum. It's found in the cartilage that connects your ribs to your sternum. It's the chondr and hypochondriac, the hypochondriac region. It's found as well in the caps of the bones, the ends of the bones that form joints. It helps those bones slide and move past one another without the bones rubbing against each other. So if you've heard about people's cartilage wearing down in their knees, they're talking about hyaline cartilage. And the last part is called fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is found in the discs between the vertebra and where the front of the hip pelvic bones join together, the pubic symphysis, and a few other areas like that. It looks way too much like hyaline cartilage under a slide, in my opinion, for me to ask you to distinguish it, so I won't ask you to do that. But it is one of the types, and it is an important tissue type that I want you to understand and know about, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about it as different body parts come up. So to recap, hyaline cartilage, common, joins ribs to sternum. It's the ends of our big bones that form joints. Around the windpipe. It's flexible, but it's also strong. And it looks like that. Elastic, really the most common being the auricle of the ear. It snaps back into place. It's flexible, it's not too strong. But it is useful. And then this fibrous cartilage, fibrocartilage, is found in between the bones of the spine and where the two pubic bones join together. Great shock absorbing type material. Don't you think it looks a lot like hyaline cartilage? It's very similar appearing, and I wouldn't ask you to distinguish it. Other supportive type is bone. And we have compact bone and spongy bone. A bone is a lot like an M&M that has a hard outer shell and a softer inner part. It's even better would be a candy like that that's hollow, because our bone, most of our bones are hollow. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in the muscle and bone unit. But in compact bone, the outer hard shell, these little black spaces are where the bone cells lived when this tissue was alive. And they surrounded themselves in all of this hard mineral substance. It's mineralized extracellular matrix. That's the hard bone. Compact bone is arranged into these bullseye type shapes, target shapes, with a bullseye and these rings. It's the only tissue that has these bullseye or these tree rings. Compact bone is very unique, and once you know what you're looking at, very easy to spot it. The other type of bone we're not going to look at under the microscope, not going to look at spongy bone under the microscope. But these are the two types, and we'll talk more about them in the skeletal unit. But that snapshot, compact bone, very unique. Looks to me like the rings of a tree or an onion or a target. Okay. 10 minutes, I think. The three types of muscle cell: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Skeletal muscle looks like this. These cells are shaped like cylinders, and they are stacked neatly on top of each other. Proteins inside the cell overlap with each other and give it a striped appearance. Striations mean stripes. So skeletal muscle is striped because of proteins inside the cell. I'll say more another time. This is one unique cell in the body that actually has more than one nucleus per cell. They're multiple nuclei or multinucleated, and their stripes are perfectly even and symmetric. And those stripes, each stripe is as dark as the one next to it, and they're evenly spaced and like perfect. Compared to cardiac muscle is also striped, but some of the stripes are much darker. These dark ones scattered. These are connections between two cardiac muscle cells. They're called intercalated discs. What they are is gap junctions between two cardiac muscle cells. They're called intercalated discs, and they're much darker on the slide. The other one does not have darker lines here or there. They're all the same. This one has these darker lines. These cells are branched so that this cell, for instance, has a little branch that connects with that one, and then has another limb that goes down here. So these cells are branching. Involuntary, also striped. And then finally, smooth muscle looks like this, not striped. These cells are shaped like spindles where the ends taper down to a point. Single nucleus. This looks to me a lot like dense, regular connective tissue. The difference is these nuclei are actually inside the cell. This is a cell and this is a nucleus inside the cell. Over there, the big chunky pink things were outside the cell, and the cells are nestled in between those collagen fibers. But the big difference for spotting it is that this is not wavy. The other one is very wavy and this one is not. Okay. Finally, for nervous tissue, this is not a great picture of a neuron at all, but I'll show you a slide of a neuron. There's nothing else that looks like it. It looks like a starfish. There are these remarkable, beautiful cells that look like a starfish with these long kind of limbs reaching out. We are not going to have to recognize neuroglia in the lab exam. Neuroglia look like any other cell, round cell with a round nucleus. But this cell, a neuron, doesn't look like any other cell. It's shaped like this big starfish with a long axon, and there's nothing else looks like it. So I'll point it out. So what I hope that you guys have appreciated as we've looked at these pictures is, at first glance, a lot of them look similar, but really at the end of the day, there are some dead giveaway clues that will help you distinguish them. And indeed, it's what I'm going to ask you to do on the lab exam. Not for every tissue in the book, but there's a master list that I posted. For instance, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage, elastic connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, spongy bone, those things are not on the list, lymph not on the list, okay? But we're gonna go through one more time, I'm gonna show you some of that, stuff. And then the other thing I want you guys to take away from this is the locations where these things are commonly found and their functions, a summary of their functions. Not a detailed sermon on their functions, but adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat. It has a cushioning type of function and a supportive type of function because it's like a cushion or a shock absorber, like that. Okay? Questions about tissues? There are a lot, and you could take up these whole 2 boards, writing out an outline of this, and you should. You should be able to organize all of these things, because a test question will go, which of the following is not a type of loose connective tissue? And the choices will be areolar, adipose, reticular, dense regular, and whatever else, or all of the above. And dense irregular is not a loose connective tissue. So that's how I might ask a question about that. Okay? With this other 5 minutes, let me just remind us, since we're all in one place. If you guys haven't printed this out or transferred it to your cell phones, I think it might be a good idea. Our first quiz is going to be a week from today. Right now we're here. We are probably going to just do a little bit of review and then start on skin on Thursday. And then we're going to have this quiz that's going to cover the first 3, intro, cells, and tissues, heavily, and maybe a smattering of integumentary system. I'll tell you if we cover any of that. It would be maybe just a pinch, depending on what we get to. Maybe, the first half of it or something. We'll see how far we get Thursday. But our first quiz is going to be this day. It's going to be a piece of paper that I give you, write your name on, you circle your answers. It's a closed note, no help, no teamwork. It'll be about 10, 12 questions. Those questions are going to appear on the exam. Some word for word, some modified, but in a whatever it is, 2 weeks from today, our first test. All right? Meet me in the lab in whatever time, 10 minutes.